Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society is excited to launch an innovative podcast titled Inspiring Community. The Society is very aware of the diverse, multifaceted elements of our community that come together to support children, youth, and families as they celebrate success and rise to overcome significant financial, social, and mental health challenges. Hosts Mike Clark, Manager of Public Relations and Fund Development, and Tina Allen, Manager of Community Outreach, will be reaching out to many of the Society's community partners and resource organizations to provide insight and helpful suggestions to help overcome these obstacles. The goal will be to provide a practical toolkit for listeners on topics such as managing parenting issues, financial strain, self-care, strengthening relationships, and so much more. The hope is that by talking with community experts, listeners feel more connected within a community of support. Join us as we look at new ways to reach for a better tomorrow. In this episode, we speak to Lady Laforet, Executive Director, the Welcome Center Shelter for Women and Families.
Lady, can you share about yourself and your journey that led you to be the Executive Director of the Welcome Center?
I would love to. I haven't told this story in a while, actually. When I started working at the center, I was in my early 20s. I actually started part-time at the center, and I was shelter support. And then as I worked my way up, I think it was around 2009 or so that it came up that the position of executive director was going to be open. I had just finished my master's in counseling, and the goal was actually to leave. So the goal was to go to Alberta and go into private practice. And I thought, you know what, I'll take this gig for a year and see how that turns out and get some experience. And so that was 2009, so we're 15 years ago. And I think it sort of, it gets in your blood to do residential work and to do frontline work. And so I just stayed. There was always a new challenge. There was always a new thing to be tackled, new women to meet. And I just, I've never felt the need to explore because all of my needs are met at the center.
So you've been at the center for over 15 years. Your center started over 35 years ago, and it has such a unique story. Can you tell us how the Welcome Center Shelter for Women and Families actually started?
It's actually a really interesting story, and I'm not sure, perhaps it's mirrored actually by other likely women's organizations, but it started really organically, and it started really grassroots. So it started with 5 women sitting around a dining room table. And they were having conversation about the needs of women, specifically in the west end of Windsor at the time, for additional supports. And they really just started leveraging all of their resources from there, all of their supports. There was a small house on McKay. That would have been, you're looking at late 80s. And so it went from 5 women saying, hey, there's a gap here that maybe we can support one another in filling. And it really focused heavily on supporting women, counseling groups, children's after-school programming, and really grew from there. The shelter actually didn't come on for about a decade. Mm-hmm. So even though the shelter is sort of largely what we're known for now, it actually didn't start till about 2000. Prior to that, it was mainly groups. And then the shelter really took precedence once we started running that because the need was just so great. And it very quickly became the primary focus from there. But our history just starts like many amazing things do, which was 5 women sitting around a table wanting to enact change and getting it done.
And so with the City of Windsor coming on board and asking you to take on that shelter support role, what was happening at that time? Well,
there actually had been prior to that a 3-bed shelter that had closed. And there was actually no shelter for women, no shelter for families at the time. And so when they had approached, they had initially said, would we be looking to partner to provide services? The agreement was initially starting really low. We had, I believe, 8 beds to begin. And you've really seen the transition over the years. So the city had approached us to provide that sort of gendered lens to the services. And the actual family shelter piece didn't come on until our recent move. There actually has not been any bricks and mortar shelter for families. So we were doing that largely off-site. When the city came on, it was a transition from 3 beds to 8 beds to 11 beds to 12 beds to 12 beds plus some mats on my living room floor. And then from there is when we've really made our biggest move.
Okay. Wow.
Lady, I echo Tina. It's so good to have you with us today. Now, there's some exciting news with you and with your organization, and you have a much new and larger location on Tuscarora, which is really exciting for the downtown area specifically, but for the city overall. So what has this new space allowed you to do?
The new space, so we've moved to 500 Tuscarora, which is geographically changed our services. So we're coming from West End to right to the downtown core. And really the transformation was we were providing a small space, 17 beds for single women, and we were supporting families off-site, no bricks and mortar shelter at area motels. This gave our community the first of its kind bricks and mortar shelter for families. So we actually went from having no shelter to being able to provide upwards of 29 families shelter at any given time. And then for singles, it's went from 17 in our small house on Bridge to upwards of 32 women who we can support at a time. So that's really leveraged for us things like incorporating the city's first pet-friendly shelter spaces. So we have 8 units that are available for those who are entering the shelter system who have been leery to or might have chosen not to because they had pets with them, and it really allowed us to partner a lot more broadly because we physically had the space for the first time in 20 years to do so.
Are you still utilizing off-site supports to house people?
Unfortunately, we sometimes still do. It's come down largely to occupancy and need, and as shelter volumes have went up, when there is an overflow bit, 29 for us is actually already overflow. So we have 21 units for families. Okay. We can go up to 29 when we absolutely need to. When we cap at that, we are actually very, very lucky as a community that we have a very responsive community entity that will work with us to continue to provide some additional spaces to try and ensure that there would never be a situation with a family on the street.
Now, we know in our community and communities across Canada, there's a major housing crisis. Combine that with the high cost of living that all of us are dealing with, but those folks that have challenges and have obstacles in their way, it's even more of a crisis type of situation. So how can you tell us about how this has impacted your programs and how the volumes are that you're seeing today based on those facts?
Well, we know that they're generally, in terms of the increases, there's sort of like 2 factors that are coming into that, and that's the growing shortage of affordable housing that we're familiar with nationally, combined with an increase in poverty. So as far as our shelter volumes go, when you combine those 2 things, it makes it difficult for shelters to operate, I would say, at the efficiency and at the level they would want. So there's markers of a good shelter. So to be a good shelter, you want to house people quickly, and you want to do that as quickly as you can, and you want them to stay housed. And it's really hard to reach those markers when you're now in a situation where the lack of affordable housing is making it difficult for us to house people. So for us, volumes are getting higher because our length of stays are getting longer, and there's really just such a continued inflow into the shelter system because of that affordable housing crisis, because of the deepening poverty rates.
Mm-hmm.
So our community is most familiar with your shelter services. So can you tell us more about what other programs and services that you offer in the shelter?
Oh, for sure. I think it's definitely a misconception piece for us. The big one, first of all, being we are the Welcome Center shelter for women and families. So what comes from that is, families actually do include men. Mm-hmm. Crazy, isn't it? There's some families have men. So we do provide shelter to families that look like lots of different things. So that could be dual parent families, that could be single mom, single dad, that could be grandparent and grandchildren, aunties and nieces and nephews. So we sort of run the full gamut of what family might look like. And then for a lot of our programming, it's really tailored specifically around a housing first model of what can we do. First of all, I don't want to therapeutically incarcerate you to us, which is a really fancy way of saying the supports that you get should come from the community in which you live.
Absolutely.
So we really try to make sure that our programs are connecting you with things that already exist in the community, and you will reference them when you get back into housing, and B, things that are really tailored to helping you find housing. So we do a lot of things, for example, our harm reduction programming. So we are working in partnership with Positive Pathways for a decade, providing needle syringe programming, harm reduction programming, safe use supplies, naloxone. And what we've seen with that is that's really tailored to the increase we've seen in clients who are presenting with substance use concerns We have children's programming on site in our new building that we didn't prior. So that provides some inside and outdoor space for children who are accessing shelters so that we can recognize that children are experiencing homelessness as well. They're not necessarily just accompanying their caregivers into shelter. So we have children's programming for that. We are part of the Shelter Health Network, which is a program that provides general practitioner access to those who are within the system. That means that we have an amazing GP who is on site 1 day a week currently. We're looking to increase it to meet with any clients on site who have medical needs. And that can range from well baby checks to blood tests and referrals to sending people out for x-rays for broken bones. So it runs a bit of the full gamut there. And we do also, with that partnership, provide DOA, who's an amazing practical nurse who is on site 5 days a week, who we share with some other agencies as well, to act as sort of a buffer and a conduit between clients and the medical system sometimes. In addition to that, we have a peer support program. So we've taken on peer support largely in the past few years to ensure that the women are getting supports by and for them, by women who have lived experience of homelessness, of poverty, of substance use, of accessing the shelter system. That's been a very big push that we've made. And in addition to that, we continue with our drop-in that has been ongoing since probably 2005, 2006. And that's really a program aimed at street and trench women, or any woman in the community who identifies is perhaps being housing unstable or looking for some level of resources, supports, education, and really doing that within a women-centric space where she can feel comfortable and safe.
So you've alluded to that stay period. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how does that look on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month of how individuals, families transition out, or, there is no specific deadline that they have to leave?
When you look at shelters, perhaps a decade ago, 15 years ago, when I was doing housing support, we had what's called the 2-week rule. So you came in the door and you had 14 days and we were going to solve all of your problems and find you housing and everything was going to be great. And we've really, really let that go and moved where we should, which is a really person-centered approach to say that every person's journey through that system is going to be a little bit unique. So there's overarching things that are likely going to be similar. So we're likely working with women who are in poverty. We're working with housing barriers, with lack of transportation, with a lot of systemic barriers, stigma, bias. But then that gives us time to really focus on each unique household and tailor the program to their needs. So there is no definitive, you came in on day one, a clock is counting down until you get out. The goal is that you're going to stay as long as it takes you and I to work together to resolve your homelessness, with the knowledge that we're trying to do that as quickly and as efficiently as we can. So when you come in, you're going to meet with a worker, you're going to have conversations about what strengths you have, what barriers there are to your housing, where are you coming from housing-wise, what's your housing history looking like, what's your income like, do we need to help you there or get income supports? And then we start the housing search within this market, and that's going to take however long it takes, especially depending on what your needs are. For example, a senior looking for an accessible unit, that might take longer than a family looking for a 1 or 2 bedroom unit. So the length of stay is really going to end up at the end of the day tailored to the needs of the specific family.
Is there a distinction made between families where there's absolute homelessness versus sort of that hidden kind of couch surfing, hopping around to different families? Do you first try to see if they have anyone in the community to stay with before they come to you?
Oh, 100%. I think diversion is going to be a necessary component of any really well-running emergency shelter system. And that's sort of misunderstood as well. There's sort of this idea that diversion is about closing the door and not letting you in. Mm-hmm. And that's not at all the point. The point is to make sure that those who do get in are the ones who have exhausted every other resource. So we've seen a shift perhaps in the past maybe decade or so from shelter really being the first option when you were in a housing crisis to getting to where it should be, which is shelter is really truly at the end of the day a last resort. And it's for when you've exhausted family and friends and other options. So any call to the shelter will start with a diversion conversation about what supports do you have? Let's talk about your family. What would it take for you to be able to stay with them? Do you have any friends? Do you have any coworkers that you could stay with even for a little bit? What resources are you using to look for housing now? We often get calls from someone who might be 30 plus days out from potentially experiencing homelessness. And you can do a lot in 30 days. So let's get you connected with as many resources as we can. The goal being anyone who can be diverted from shelter, let's go with that. And then once people come in from there, they would complete their day one. And we would still continue actually to retouch on that diversion conversation throughout your stay.
Great.
Yeah, and I think to add to that question, you just touched on lots of individual circumstances and that families and women that come to your shelter and that type of thing face. But what would you say are the greatest concerns that you deal with on a day-to-day basis that impact these families and these individuals that come to your door?
100% for us is going to be the lack of affordable housing. So the challenges that we have are very, very difficult to try to have a single mom specifically compete in this market. So we know obviously nationally, internationally, there's an affordable housing crisis. And when you're really looking at that competition and you take a single mom on income support, she's the bottom of the rung in terms of competition for units within the private market. So the primary challenge is that we're working in a landlord's market for sure, that it's very, very difficult around the stigma and the bias around experiencing homelessness or poverty in general. So, you're even seeing stories now in the news that landlords continue to deny rentals to families with children, which is a human rights issue at the end of the day. But when you are living in a shelter and just trying to find housing, you're not the one who's likely going to take on a lot of those challenges. So you just continue on to the next one. So the biggest challenge for us is definitely just how does a woman who is on an income rate that is largely unchanged in decades, how does she compete in a private market where the cost of rent is likely double the entirety of her Ontario Works check?
Lady, we know you do tremendous amount of advocacy work in our community, and probably outside our community from a provincial, potentially even beyond that. Can you talk to us a bit about what it looks like to advocate for these individuals and families? What is the priority? What is the greatest focus for advocacy work to address these barriers to housing and just overall well-being?
We try to make sure that anything being done at the provincial, the federal level that includes us is likely me just loudly screaming data over and over again, and really reinforcing that nothing is going to change without really sound and evidence-based policy. And so our focus is really on things like, provincially really putting as much pressure as we can on our provinces to increase income security rates that are actually historically at the lowest they've ever been right now. And federally, we say, look at industry experts, look at, for example, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and they've released some policy directives to the feds that's really advocating for a homelessness prevention and housing benefit. And that's, when we look at, say, CERB and what CERB did to lift people out of poverty and prevent homelessness, as a shelter provider, I know that focuses on rent supports, income support programs like that are really going to slow the intake into the shelter system. And it's going to lift a lot of people over poverty. So we're really, really focused on, yes, we talk about supply, that we need to be looking at development. We need to be looking at the acquisition of deeply affordable housing that's owned more so by the community, that we need to take stock of what we currently have. We need to be renovating units. So supply definitely 100% needs to be a huge focus, federally led. Well, that is happening because we know that it's going to take us decades to potentially start to really, really hit any deep change there. We really need to keep the focus on the meantime on that income support piece. Because when we're looking at women who are on some of the lowest, dollar for dollar rates in decades, we will never be able to catch up until we start focusing on the income security needs for some of our most vulnerable women.
Let's talk about your own funding. How is your center funded, and what does the community do to support the work that you're doing?
The primary funding for the center is HPP, which is the Homelessness Prevention Program. That's a provincially run program aimed largely at programs that are preventing or responding to homelessness. We've been funded by some iteration of that program, going back as far as Skippy, 20 plus years. So that covers about 80% of the cost of shelter. One thing we've noticed, especially during our transition time, we're now into year 2 in our new space, is that those rates are largely unchanged. So you wouldn't see things like a cost of living increase or things like that don't tend to occur in those programs. So what went from being sort of years ago, it might have been, it covers 90% of what we do. And then it covered 85% of what we do. And then this year, I would say we're probably resting about 80, because what we're seeing is that gap in things like wages, cost of living increases. The move to Tuscarora was not without massive additional expenses that we're still sort of navigating as we head into year 2. So the other 20% largely becomes our biggest focus. And that's a mix of sort of grants, donations, fundraising efforts. That's sort of your quilting. That's when you're quilting together little bits and pieces. And the things largely that does cover for us are things like our harm reduction worker, our peer support workers, our donation funded, our volunteer coordinator. She coordinates upwards of 400 hours a month for shelter volunteers. That's an unfunded piece. The renovations to the building, program supplies, sometimes honestly even things like toilet paper. By the end of the year, we've maxed out our funding on that. So it's a lot of quilting bits and pieces together for that last 20%. And it's definitely an area that we try to keep an eye on. We are as lean an agency as I think you can get, but there's always ways for the community to support beyond financial. Obviously, yes, if you have the financial means, we most definitely need donations. One thing we see, though, is that we are volunteer heavy. So if you're looking to volunteer, we say always reach out, always for in-kind donations as well. So the community can always assist with things like those basic needs, toiletries, supplies, deodorant, hairbrushes, sort of any of the things that you're using on the daily, we would likely have a need for as well. We would definitely say keep in touch with us on social media. We're quite active on Facebook and Instagram. So just sort of keep an eye on what we're asking for. We tend to go with if we ask, the need is imminent. So we don't do a lot of stockpiling. We're an agency that tends to be quiet until we have a need, and then we ask for it loudly. So I would say keep an eye on our Facebook, largely for things like that, if you're looking to support. And then that also lets you know, because we're quite active generally in the community, if there's things coming up that you could be a part of. So if there's things coming up that might be related to the agency or homelessness or poverty or women's issues, largely we're going to request your assistance with that. That might be on sending out letters to someone. That might be on where your votes are going to go and sharing information. So follow us as much as you can, and then look to donate it and support. Largely just look to talk about the center and the work that we're doing. Talk about homelessness, talk about poverty, have those conversations with your family over the dinner table, and really just make sure that the idea of supporting women who are experiencing homelessness is not a shocking story.
No, and I think a big role that we can play in the community as individuals is really around breaking down that stigma.
Yes.
For sure.
Now, you've had many people come through your doors over the years, and, it's a transitionary period until they're getting to the next step of their journey. Is there a scenario at all that you can share with us of an outcome, a success story of somebody that used your services for that brief period of time and then moved forward?
Oh, for sure. I think there's success in every day. And one of the things we're always challenging the community on as well is to really think about your definition of success. So we often find a lot of that stigma, a lot of that bias is sort of like based on this idea that you come in broken and we will fix you. And then we will churn you back out into the community, and you will have your dream job, and you will have the house with the white picket fence. And success often looks very, very different for many of our women. So, for example, we've had clients, and I know this only because it's close to the first of the month, which is a very busy time for us as we're moving families out generally for the first, is a lot of families who came in that might be coming in generally because of, say, a domestic violence situation, a familial breakdown, or families we've had that have honestly couch surfed largely for the better part of the past year or so because they weren't able to compete in the market. So they come in, stay with us probably longer than we would have liked. So we had a family that stayed with us probably upwards of 5 months because there was some additional challenges around their income and their access to their child tax benefit, and there were some tax implications, and that really limited what they were able to do housing-wise. And once that was, you work through a housing worker, and that got resolved. During that time, she ended up actually, the mom of that situation ended up making sure her kids stayed in school, enrolled them in a new school close to shelter. Kids ended up making decent friends at that school. They were involved in after-school sports. We had the mom who was actively engaged within programming. She was seeing the doctor regularly. And the day that she found the unit that ultimately she ended up getting, she was beaming. And because they enjoy us, they enjoy the shelter from time to time, depending on who you ask. But ultimately, you want to get out. right? So to see that look of joy on her face that she was going to have her own 4 walls, she was going to have her own keys, and then our workers support you in getting beds for your place and getting furniture for your place and getting, your first pots and pans and things like that. And the day she moved, it's strange because she cries because she doesn't necessarily want to go, because you have 24-hour supports, right? You've built this sense of community over 5 months. It's just like living in an apartment building at that point. And yet this is what we've been working for. And so there was tears. And then ultimately what you'll see is a lot of those families and those women will be back next week because they'll come for our drop-in. And that transition time when it's really, really difficult to go from living in a shelter with 100 other bodies to 4 walls and silence can be very, very difficult. I would say our most challenging case, and I'll probably make her listen to this actually, is we had a client who was with us, single client, 6+ months at least. I wanted to keep her by that point and just start charging her rent. Could not find a spot that met her needs. She had high medical needs. She had to have supportive housing. She had to have her medical needs met as well. She can be a handful. She knows this. It took us quite a while. It's probably about 6 months before a bed spot came up at a program that would be a fit for her. And she went and she came back to visit every day the first week to tell us about how horrible it was and how it wasn't as good as us and how she wished she could come back, but she totally understood. And those visits trailed off. So it went from every day to a couple times a week to once a week to maybe it's not so bad to now where she pops in maybe once a month or so and looks fantastic and tells us that, it's still maybe not her ideal place, but that she's content that she got out of shelter and that her needs are being met. So those are sort of why you stay. Right? It's like those when you're in residential work, like those are the reasons that you go, yeah, okay, I can do this for another day. I can do this for another week. I can take the screaming. I can take the capital repairs. I can take the begging for dollars because she came and is having an amazing day and shared that with us.
Yeah.
I think both of those stories are important examples that it's not just about being housed. It's everything else that comes with that empowerment piece, that ongoing support, that transition.
Oh, it very much is. And I think, when the onslaught of housing first came, it was this idea of get everybody housed first, obviously, and then deal with, wraparound supports from there. And we see more and more, especially within the community of our really, really high needs clients, that you can't move forward with housing without those wraparound supports. And those supports could be anything from your social supports, medical, that system navigation piece that so many people struggle with. And that's why we've really tried to focus our peer support work on our drop-in program, because that's some of the feedback we get from clients is that the difficulty of transitioning out of homelessness is really misunderstood. And so we're happy to have drop-in to allow that space so your transition can sort of occur a little more at your own pace as opposed to here's some keys and now you move.
Anyhow, just so many great testimonials and so much good work that's obviously going on at your organization. So I guess any final thoughts on how together as a community and individually, how we can all come together and work together to support these families and these individuals?
I think there's the bigger picture down to the smaller picture. So bigger picture, vote at every level that you can. Be asking everyone you can about housing and where housing sort of fits into the plan. At the local level, be aware of the services. And really, I would start with that anti-stigma piece and that anti-bias piece. So there's still so much stigma around poverty. And we like to talk about class as if it's not an ism anymore, but classism very much still exists. And the majority of our clients are touched by it. So really be having those conversations about unpacking the stigma around experiencing poverty or substance use or mental health and how all of those things might sort of come together at various points. And really just open your mind to the idea that homelessness really truly is a state, not a trait. So it's a state that you're in for a bit as opposed to a personality trait of yours. And that really goes a long way to the community really being more willing to embrace that these are community members at the end of the day. These are our neighbors and they deserve our support just as much as anyone else does.
Lady, it's been great having you with us today. So much great information, very enlightening to hear about the services that are offered through your organization that do support individuals, families, women within our community, and particularly in the downtown core. You know, I think this is the next step for transition for individuals. It's a welcome step that people in a difficult time face. And again, I think Tina and I would just like to thank you for sharing that with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Anything that gives new voice to issues of homelessness and poverty in Windsor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us on Inspiring Community. And until next time, have a great day.